I'm Joe Uhan, and I'm here today to talk about what I think is one of the most important parts of efficient running mechanics, the hip hinge. So I've been writing for I Run Far for almost 8 years, and I've written almost 100 columns. And during that time, I've written a lot about running mechanics because I feel like it's so important with respect to not only avoiding aches and pains, but running as fast as we can, as far as we want, and feeling good while doing so. Because indeed, how we run plays the biggest role in how we feel and how we perform. And so I've written about everything from upright posture to hip mechanics to arm swing to foot strike. But what I'm going to talk about today is really what sort of puts it together, what's the foundation to it all, and that's this idea of hip hinge. And hip hinge is a way of orienting our body in space to create the most efficient propulsion in the minimal amount of landing stress. And so if we take a step back, we talk about what I wrote about a year ago, and posture, upright posture, we talked about this idea of stacking and angling, of taking our mechanical system and making sure it is stacked vertically and that the angle is more or less neutral front to back. And this has the effect of attenuating stress through our body, of getting automatic core engagement, and leading to more efficient hip utilization and landing. But the big question is, well, how do we take this thing into running? And my answer to that is through the hip hinge. And so there's a lot of debate, believe it or not, about how we orient ourselves when we run. Some people think that we lean, and that to do that lean, we engage the ankles. And to me, that just has never resonated as something that's efficient. Because if I get in this position and I lean my body out in front of my ankles, this doesn't feel stable to me. And it has to do with this idea of body mass versus base of support. And so when we run, our legs, or really our feet, act as a base of support. And so whatever position we're going to be in, we want our body more or less alternating between our two legs, which function as bases of support. So in this position, it's like, is this really efficient? Is this really sustainable? When my base of support is essentially behind me and I'm like hanging out here, I feel like I'm having to hold myself up. There's another camp that then thinks, okay, well, research has shown that there's increased landing stresses to some degree with the forward lean, so we just shouldn't forward lean at all. We need to be upright. And that I don't think is accurate either. There needs to be a way to get forward orientation that is sustainable. And we're going to talk about why that is. But where the hip hinge comes into play is it provides a way to shift our body from the rear leg onto the forward landing leg. And so to get in this position, we first find our efficient upright posture. And then what we're going to do is what I call the starting line position. And every runner should know this. And it's taking the body from a forward orientation into this foot back positioning. And in doing so, what we've done are a couple things. Number one, I have maintained that vertical alignment. If you look at my rear ankle, I'm in a straight line ankle to ear as I was in this position, but now I'm oriented forward. And what that does is that splits my body between my previous base of support, that push-off leg, and my soon-to-be new base of support, my landing leg. So this is my neutral-oriented position. But the other thing that you'll notice is what happens here, and this is what I call the hip hinge. And so technically a hip hinge means that the only motion in the system is occurring at the hip. So this, or even this motion, is this isolated motion at the hip. But when I get into my starting line position, you can see I'm going into a hip hinge. And the operative component of this position is when I am in my starting line position, I've got a little knee bend here and some relative hip bend here. And that's super important as it relates to push off and propulsion. So here is the first reason why a hip hinge is such a superior position for forward propulsion. Because if I land in this position, now my hip has something to do. I land here, I can pass over that leg and push off. My powerful glute muscles can take that leg from the flex position and extend it behind. The glutes are the most powerful muscle, and they create a rotary action of the stride so that when we land, they extend, and then we get that cyclical follow through that is most efficient. Without the hip hinge, we have nowhere to go. If I'm not in a hip flexed position, then the glutes have nowhere to push or nowhere to pull. And I'm forced to either bounce with excessive vertical oscillation, or I have to cheat with lumbar extension to get any sort of rearward propulsion and get my body going forward. So that's the first major benefit of the hip hinge. And arguably the more important benefit is to generate the place for the glutes to do work, to push off and pull behind. The second thing has to do with landing efficiency, because in the efficient state, we want the foot to land underneath our body. That's really important because we want to preserve energy for forward propulsion. And there's a certain amount of our energy that when we land, we store it instantaneously and then use it to push off. But if I'm too upright and I don't have any hip hinge, it is really hard for me to land underneath my body. So instead, there's a tendency to land in front of the body. And it doesn't matter whether it's forefoot, midfoot, or rear foot. Any part of the foot that lands in front of the body when my center mass is back here, that's going to be a braking force, where energy is now absorbed and wasted rather than landing underneath and propelling across. And so thus, the hip hinge does two things. We've got the loading of the hip to push off, but it also orients our body forward in a sustainable way. So rather than doing this awkward leaning with a straight leg, I'm now in this athletic position where my trunk is sustainably forward, and most importantly, supported by the new base of support. And then that really brings us to what's so great about this position, and that's the idea of kind of universal concepts. I'm always looking for unifying principles. What's good for football or what's good for martial arts should be the same things that are good for running, because we're just one human species, one human body doing different things. And this position, hip hinging, this is the universal athletic position. Butt back, chest forward, slight knee bend gives us stability, it gives us control, and it gives us power. And you see this across every sport. If this is running, this is golf, this is volleyball, this is basketball defense, and this is football. They're all versions of a hip hinge, loading the hip to do work, to be stable, and to give us athleticism. And so that's why the hip hinge is such a great position for us to be in as runners, because it's ultimately the most athletic position. And so to get into this as a runner, you find your good posture, you get into the start line position, but then I want you to try to play with a couple things. Number one, feel the difference between being in this pelvis posterior position. Watch how my pelvis is behind my chest. A lot of us runners, including me habitually, will do this. It's like, well, I'm in a staggered stance, but where am I? I've lost the hip hinge. My pelvis is underneath me. Feeling the pelvis behind you is super important. The other thing is this idea of like being into the hip. Because to not be into the hip is to not have flexion. And to not have flexion means the hip has nothing to do. And so I call this standing up in your stride. So if we're in this starting line position, but I've lost my hip hinge, I'm now upright. And it's only a matter of time before I get back to here. And the reason has to do with overusing the low back, and the low back kind of pulls you like a parachute. And so the key, or the cue that I really like for runners, is this idea of running through a tunnel. So I'm 6 feet tall. I like to think about running through a 5'11" tall tunnel. Because if you watch where my head's right above the video screen anyway, if I get into my hip hinge, look at my overall height. I sink down an inch or two. So when I'm in my hip, I can fit in that 5'11" tunnel. If I stand up in my stride, I'm banging my head on that tunnel. So that's a really nice cue for runners to feel this position. So try it for yourself. Feel that hip hinge. Exercise, do core stability, and a lot of the hip strengthening and running specific exercises we do are in this position. And then get on a treadmill or go outside and have somebody film you to check out this position. And I guarantee you it's going to feel good and result in fast, pain-free running. Good luck.